The suspension bridge groaned, shedding cables like dead skin into the roaring black water below. Commander Elias Thorne hung suspended by a single, bleeding hand. Beneath his boots, the hyperstorm churned the floodwaters into a lethal froth of debris and shattered prism steel. The main support truss screamed, buckling inward. His fingers slipped. Would you risk everything for a world that bought you to die? Or would you let the storm take it all? Let's find out. 3 weeks earlier, the only storm was the suffocating silence of the royal transport. Krell, newly appointed junior exarch of the Luminant Hegemony, adjusted his restrictive ceremonial collar and watched Princess Lyra step onto the dirt of Aegis IV to meet her punishment. The union ceremony possessed none of the hegemony's traditional grandeur. There were no choral resonances, no banners of spun light. They stood in a drafty civic hall illuminated only by the pale, pulsing bioluminescence of native fungus lamps. Lyra remained rigid, her pristine posture a final defense against her absolute exile. She had championed the Forbidden Equality Doctrine, a treasonous text proposing that Terrans were sentient equals rather than beasts of burden. Now, High Sovereign Valen had legally bound her to one. It was a brilliant, cruel irony designed to break her spirit. Krell kept his hands folded neatly within his robes, his respiratory gills fluttering rapidly in the thin, metallic air. He had read the planetary briefs. Aegis IV was a harsh frontier, a rock where manual labor was the only currency. He expected the Terran leader to be a lumbering brute, eager to gloat over his newly purchased royal prize. Commander Elias Thorne simply signed the digital datapad. He did not sneer. He did not even look at the princess with resentment. He secured the hegemony fleet's promise to orbit his vulnerable colony, finalized the marital contract, and offered a curt, pragmatic nod. The mandated inspection of the settlement began immediately. Krell trailed a few paces behind the newly bound pair, his hand hovering near his concealed stun baton. He had been taught at the academy that Terrans were a blunt force species. They were useful for extracting heavy ores and dying in hazardous environments, but entirely devoid of higher cognitive function. Beneath the graded walkways, a rhythm played. It was the uneven, mechanical thud of a patched water pump vibrating up through the floorboards, a constant reminder of frontier survival. The sound pulsed like a slow, tired heartbeat beneath the colony. Krell found it deeply unsettling. Elias stopped at a maintenance bay where a massive atmospheric processor had cracked its outer casing. Without issuing a command, the commander took a heavy plasma torch from a soot-stained worker. Krell watched, his ocular slits narrowing, as the Terran's calloused hands manipulated the volatile arc of energy. The hegemony archives classified them as fundamentally savage, a species of mere instinct and violence. No, it must be a learned mimicry. Krell forced his secondary heart to slow its pacing. He watched the molten metal seal perfectly along the microfracture, an operation requiring advanced spatial geometry. Elias powered down the torch and handed it back. He then turned to Lyra. The commander reached into his heavy utility coat and withdrew a small, rectangular object. Krell leaned forward slightly. It was not a weapon. It was a physical manuscript. A worn, yellow-paged book of Terran philosophy, its spine held together by coarse woven fiber. "I was told you value theory," Elias said. His voice was a low gravel rumble, cutting easily through the background thud of the water pump. "We don't have much of it here. We are too busy surviving. But my father brought this from the old world." Lyra stared at the offering. Her hands, clean and manicured, contrasted sharply with the grease-stained cover. Krell fully expected her to swat it away, to reject the crude artifact. Instead, she took it. Her fingers carefully traced the faded, incomprehensible lettering on the cover. She held it close to her chest, a silent, confusing transaction that Krell could not process. The tour proceeded into the educational sector. Krell expected breeding pens or raw combat arenas, as the propaganda reel suggested. He found classrooms. Young Terrans sat beneath flickering screens, mapping out orbital mechanics and calculating agricultural yields. The junior exarch felt a cold dread pooling in his stomach. This was not a labor camp. This was a civilization quietly holding its breath. Above the settlement, the sky turned the color of bruised iron. The warning klaxons shrieked. Krell stumbled, his auditory canals overwhelmed by the sudden, piercing wail. Elias moved instantly. The quiet, stoic mechanic vanished, replaced entirely by the commander. Raid protocol. Elias barked into a wrist comm, his massive frame shifting toward the nearest blast door. Shields to maximum. Evacuate the outer rings to the deep shelters. A raid? Lyra asked. Her regal composure finally fractured, revealing the frightened exile beneath. Void Reavers, Elias said, tearing a kinetic rifle from a magnetic wall rack. He did not look back at her. They like the weather. Keep your exarch safe, princess. Krell felt the ambient temperature plummet. The distinct, metallic scent of ozone and rain-slicked prism steel flooded the corridor, arriving just moments before the first orbital strike hammered against the planetary shield. The floor violently pitched upward, throwing Krell to his knees as the frontier erupted. The deep shelter was cold and vibrating with the concussive force of the orbital bombardment. Krell huddled against the damp stone, his gills flaring in panic. The frantic squeak of wet rubber boots on the metal grating anchored him to the terrifying reality of the frontier. Elias shoved the last of the civilians through the heavy blast doors. Lyra stumbled against the wall, her royal composure finally giving way to exhaustion. She braced herself for the expected degradation, the inevitable gloating of a lesser species. He merely handed her a sealed oxygen pack and turned his back toward the screaming storm. The medical center, Elias shouted over the deafening roar of the breached atmosphere. The flood walls are failing. The torrential black water swallowed the lower agricultural tiers instantly, ripping centuries of careful bioengineering from the bedrock as Elias sprinted toward the buckling suspension bridge, fully aware that the medical sector on the far side housed 300 defenseless civilians. Krell and Lyra followed him into the tempest, driven by an inexplicable need to witness the Terran's desperate effort. They reached the gorge just as the main support truss snapped. This was the moment the bridge died. Commander Elias Thorne hung suspended by a single, bleeding hand over the lethal froth of shattered prism steel, his boots kicking at empty air. The metal shrieked. Before Elias could pull his battered frame over the edge, the clouds above them violently parted. A massive shadow eclipsed the hyperstorm. High Sovereign Valen's flagship descended, its anti-gravity thrusters repelling the floodwaters into walls of spray. The Sovereign himself stood upon the extending boarding ramp, clad in radiant ceremonial armor. He pointed his executioner's blade down at the struggling Terran, his voice amplified across the gorge, invoking the ancient rite of the ritual duel. A 9-foot god of war challenging a bleeding man over a dying colony. Elias hauled himself over the edge of the broken grating. He drew a heavy, rusted industrial blade from his utility belt. He did not yield. But before the Sovereign could leap down to strike, Lyra moved. She stepped onto the crumbling edge of the suspension bridge, deliberately placing her fragile body between the towering Sovereign and the wounded mechanic. She raised her chin, shouting her absolute and permanent allegiance to Aegis 4 over the roar of the wind. Valen halted. Krell watched his Sovereign lower the executioner's blade, the absolute authority of the hegemony faltering in the face of such staggering, irrational sacrifice. The Sovereign offered a single, rigid nod of acknowledgement before the warships slowly ascended, leaving them to their hard-won survival. Months later, the newly reinforced suspension bridge cast a long, steady shadow over the calm waters below. Krell stood silently on the observation deck, observing the princess in the quiet morning light. The yellow-paged book of Terran philosophy rested openly on her lap. It was no longer a crude artifact of a condemned world, but the foundational text of a sovereign galactic hub, its fragile spine bound tightly in gleaming prism steel.